Hey there, and welcome to the Spring Daffodil Tutorial Sneak Peek. Now, in this beautiful daffodil tutorial, the first thing that I did was I painted the center of the first daffodil with a little clear water, and I'm just going to drop in some yellow, mixed with just a teeny bit of orange. And I'm using the wet on wet technique here. And later I'm going to add glazes to add some depth to that center, but we're just getting the first glaze on right here. So once I get that done and I get it the way that I want it, I'm going to start working on the outer trumpet. And what I've done there is I've made up a peachy orange mixture. I'm wetting it in sections and working in sections and dropping in the peachy color and then lifting out some of the areas just to make it have some shadow and depth. Once that dried, I went right back over and added a little bit more shadows. We're glazing now, and with a little bit darker peach mixture, and it's also a little bit thicker than the original one. Once I got that in, I would let that dry. Then I took a little bit of green and I started really glazing over that center part, being sure to start defining the stamen and the anthers in the center, and paying attention to where my really dark areas are, and also softening it up around the edges so that we don't have too many hard edges. This flower is really beautiful. It reminds me of spring. It's one of the first flowers that bloom in our area, so of course I had to paint it. Once you let that dry, then we're going to start working on the outer petals. I've made a purpley gray mixture and I've wet the petal first, and then I'm just going to lightly, using a really light hand, drop in the shadows on each of the flower petals, and I'm just going to work steadily around the flower, putting in each one of the shadow areas with this really light purpley gray mixture. I'm also just smoothing it out using a damp dry brush and picking up some of the areas where it got a little dark. Again, it's just the wet on wet technique. I wet the petal and then I drop in those purpley gray areas, the shadow areas. Once that first layer dries, now I'm coming back and glazing over a more purpley type glaze over that gray glaze to define the shadows a little bit more, really make them pop. I'm also adding a little texture to each petal wherever I see the lines and the creases, the little folds, rolls, and bumps. And I'm also still working on the wet on wet technique. And I'm using my brush to blend that color out. I want to keep it a little bit darker wherever you have it in the most shadow. Wherever it's dark, the darkest shadow is, of course, that's where you want to put the most paint. Now I'm just picking up a little bit using a lifting technique so that we can cut out the highlights or pull up the highlights. Once that's dry, I'm going to come in here and add just a little bit more color. Again, wetting the petal first and then just applying my color where I see the shadows and blending it with the tip of my brush. So now we're going to work on the second daffodil. I did almost the same thing. I'm wetting it in sections and working around the trumpet with that same peachy mixture. This time the center of the flower is not facing us. You can just see a little bit of the stamen. So I'm not going to have to put the yellow and the green in there. I'm just mostly focusing on that peachy orange color. And again, I'm using the wet on wet technique. Once that's finished and dry, I'm going to do the same exact thing to the petals of the second daffodil that I did to the first. Wet on wet, apply the shadows with the purpley mix, and work your way around the flower as you go. And once that first layer is dry, you'll want to go ahead and add another layer just to add some more depth and shadows to those flower petals as you work around. And I'm just going to show you how I'm doing that here. I let the first layer dry, and now I'm just adding another layer of that purpley blue mixture. And I'm also just using the same wet on wet technique. I am using a really light touch though, because I don't want to disturb that first layer that I just let dry. And I want to keep it pretty smooth. So I am just enhancing some of those shadows, darkening them up. And that really just lets those petals pop and look a little more realistic. And once you get those nice shadows in, we'll start working on the greenery, the stems. I'm just taking a nice sap green mixture and working it into where the stems are, making sure that I apply the shadows as I see them, and adding a little bit of blue to the green for my shadows. And then I'm also going to start working on the little encasement where the bud's been encased, that little skin that the bud stays in. I'm going to use some of my siennas, some yellow ochre, and go ahead and paint that. First, I'm just going to do a layer of the ochre color with a little tiny bit of the sienna. Put that over the whole shape. The paper's dry. This time I'm using wet on dry. It's a smaller area. But I am going to come back in here and I'm just going to start dropping in a little bit of a darker version of this yellow ochre burnt sienna type mixture. I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to it, and I'm also going to add a little bit of blue to it so that I can get some really nice shadow work in there. Now I have this laid down. It's still wet. I'm just smoothing it out with the tip of my brush, making sure it's a nice even looking wash while it's still wet. And then I'm just going to come in here with a little bit of the blue and darken up that burnt sienna yellow ochre type mixture. And just start dropping in shadows and creases all around the this little casing that the bud used to be in. I don't know really what it's called, so we're just going to say casing. So I'm just going to put in those shadows, smooth them out. Put in some of the wrinkles, make sure I'm getting the shadows in the right spot. And the lighter, like the mid-tone shadows, I'm adding less blue. For the darker shadows, I'm adding more blue to make it a darker color. And I'm not doing anything hard or complicated, and I'm not following the reference exactly. I'm just getting the large shadows in, because when you view it from a distance you'll be able to tell what it is. So getting that all done, and then after that we're going to start working on the background. I'm going to show you how to do the background. Now I have a separate video how to do a simple watercolor background that you can go watch and see the whole process of how I did this background, but here I'm just going to show you a quick little peek of how I did it. So everything's completely dry. The next thing I'm going to do is put clear water down. In this one, my brush is a little too small for the job that I'm doing, so I will change my brush and make it a bigger brush so that I don't have to spend 100 hours just trying to paint water in this little background, getting it covered with the water wash. And this is just going to be another wet in wet technique, just using a medium blue and a darker blue. Just wetting it down. I'm working in sections. Once I get all the water in there on this section, I'm just going to start dropping in a medium blue. I'm not going to cover up every bit of the white background of the paper. I am going to go a little darker around the flowers, my subject. Add a little bit more water where I want it to be a little bit paler color blue. I'm going to do that to add some interest and make it look almost like there's clouds back there without actually painting clouds. So I'm just going to drop that blue in there, working my way around the section that I've gotten wet. You want to try to work fast because you don't want to leave a hard edge. You want this a nice, soft, blurry background. And you're just going to keep on adding that blue, working fast, going around the edge where it's all wet, and being really careful not to paint over your flower. And before you know it, you'll have your beautiful blue sky background. Just continue working all around the flowers until you get to the bottom. In the bottom, do add a little bit darker blue. I'm going to give you that tip even though I'm not going to show it. And once you finish, you will have this gorgeous, beautiful daffodil painting. Now, if you want to get the complete daffodil tutorial, it can be found in my online membership, Viv Studio, at www.artwithviv.com. I hope to see you there.